Shabbat Shalom. This is Mike Klopfenstein with Messiah's New Life Tabernacle. It's April the 11th, and this is our Bible study entitled Original Intent, the Book of Galatians, Part 5. And I will say that this is going to be a very challenging study for many of you. So there may be some paradigm shifts that may occur. So I just pray that you'll consider as we go through this study, some of the things that we've learned in the past. We may have to, by looking at the evidence here, make some shifts. So it's going to be an interesting part 5. So we're going to cover the book of Galatians, chapter 3. And again, the purpose of this study is to determine the original intent that prompted Paul to write to the churches in Galatia. And why is this important to know? Because the book of Galatians is commonly used to defend this mainstream Christian theological position that Paul was teaching against following the Torah. And specifically, if one is following the Torah or law, he is intentionally trying to be made perfect by the flesh. And if you read the following verses in Galatians 3 without understanding the issues at hand or the context, you will not arrive at the correct interpretation. So just looking at Galatians 3, verses 1 through 3, and we're going to go through this chapter today. It says, O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Yeshua the Messiah hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you? This only would I learn of you, receive ye the Spirit by the works of the law or the hearing of faith? Are you so foolish, having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect in the flesh? So in chapter 3 of Galatians, Paul continues to defend, what was decided in 50 A.D. at the Council of Jerusalem concerning the Gentiles. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we read the first 3 verses. There's some comments I'm going to make again as we go through these verses. So he mentioned here that you Galatians, you've become foolish, and who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? In verse 2, he made this comment, this only would I learn of you, receive ye the Spirit by the works of the law or the hearing of faith? So ask yourself a question. What works of the law was Paul dealing with here? Verse 3, are you so foolish, having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect in the flesh? Is Paul using this term flesh here to hone in on a specific topic? For example, the circumcision of the flesh. In verse 4, he says, have you suffered so many things in vain, if it yet be in vain? He therefore that ministereth to you the Spirit, and worketh miracles among you, doeth he by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? So concerning verse 5, why does Paul use this argument concerning the gift of miracles to establish or to validate his case? How does the gift of miracles fit the narrative that Paul is dealing with a very specific law in the Torah, the law of circumcision? How does this narrative fit? Well, did you know that this is the same argument that Peter, Paul, and Barnabas used in Acts 15 to show that the Gentiles received the same promise of salvation as the Jews? So let's go there. In Acts 15, I know we've covered these verses, but it's important that we go back and we connect the dots. As we go through each verse in Galatians, connecting the dots is so key to understanding, the context of what Paul is dealing with. So in Acts 15, starting in verse 7, it says, and when there had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said unto them, men and brethren, ye know how that a good while ago God made choice among us, that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. Now notice in verse 8, and God, which knows the hearts, bear them witness, giving them the Holy Spirit, even as he did unto us. So Peter's making this case to verify that, hey, God is dealing with the Gentiles, And he has given them the blessings of Abraham, the blessings of the promise of the Messiah, that by faith they can be saved. And he put no difference between us and them in verse 9, purifying their hearts by faith. So in reading on, it says, and now therefore why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? But we believe through the grace of the Lord Yeshua Messiah, we shall be saved even as they. And then verse 12, and then all the multitude kept silence and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, who declared what miracles and wonders God had wrought among the Gentiles by them. So, are you seeing a pattern? Are you seeing a thematic connection in Paul's epistles? Are you saying that Paul is dealing with a very specific issue in the book of Galatians? So how are these verses commonly interpreted? In Matthew Henry's commentary on verses 1 through 5, I was reading this morning as I was putting the study together. The apostle, this is what Matthew Henry's commentary states concerning Galatians chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. He says, the apostle is here dealing with those who have embraced the faith in Messiah, still continue to seek for justification by the works of the law, that is, who depended upon their own obedience to the moral precepts as their righteousness before God, and wherein that was defective, had recourse to the legal sacrifices and purifications to make it up. So in other words, what Matthew Henry's commentary is saying, that what Paul was dealing with here is that the Gentiles believed that they were being justified by the works of the law, that is, the moral law in the Torah. And so that's the mindset or the theology that has come out of interpreting Paul's hard-to-understand scriptures, specifically here in Galatians. So, but again, did Paul, the apostles, or even Yeshua ever teach that obedience to the moral precepts in the Torah was not necessary or important? No. Yet people will take Paul's words and twist them or misinterpret them to their own destruction, as Peter declared in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 through 16. Paul's words, they are hard to understand, and that's why it's so important that we need to know the context of Paul's writings, and we need to connect the dots and put the whole word of Scripture together to come up with the correct interpretation. So I hope this is making sense. So John makes it very clear, the Apostle John, of the importance of obedience to the law or the Torah when we become the sons of God. So again, I'm just trying to establish a pattern here that Paul is not teaching a different doctrine of what Messiah came or what the other apostles taught. He's teaching a doctrine that's very consistent with the Torah and the prophets and what Yeshua spoke. And so here's what John had to say about the importance of being obedient to the Torah when we become the sons of God. In 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 through 11, it says, behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. But, beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And every man that hath this hope in him purifies himself, even as he is pure. Verse 4, whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law or the Torah, for sin is transgression of the Torah. And we know that he was manifested to take away what? The Torah? No, to take away our sins. And in him is no sin. So whosoever abideth in him does not sin. Whosoever sinneth hath not seen him, neither known him. So this is in the context of not that we will never sin, okay, but that we will not continue to practice sin. That's what John is dealing with here. Okay. And little children, let no man deceive you. He that doeth righteousness is righteous, even as he is righteous. So John makes it very clear here that keeping the obedience of the Torah, it's important. It is a righteous thing to do, okay? In verse 8 he says, he that commits sin or continues to practice sin is I think a more correct interpretation, is of the devil. For the devil sinneth from the beginning. For this purpose the Son of God was manifested, that he might destroy the works of the devil. For whosoever is born of God, whosoever becomes the sons of God, does not continue to practice sin, for his seed remains in him. He cannot continue in sin. And I'm adding the word continue there because it implies the way it's written, the way it's translated, that if one ever sins, then he's not a child of God. But that's not, when you look at the whole of Scripture, that's not the context. Okay, but the children, so whoever continues to practice sin are not the children of God. Okay, and whosoever, in verse 10, whosoever doeth not righteousness is not of God, neither he that loveth not his brother. For this is a message that you've heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. So again, I just wanted to use the words of the Apostle John to make it very clear that the obedience of the Torah is so important. Okay, the Apostle John is teaching a Torah principle that existed in the beginning, that we should turn from sin, from lawlessness, and of course that can be summed up or concluded as loving one another. And Ezekiel explains this Hebrew concept of living a righteous life by faith, living in obedience to the Torah by faith. Ezekiel also defines what it means to trust in one's own righteousness. And I think Ezekiel probably makes this concept that can become very difficult to understand. I think Ezekiel puts it explains it the best. So let's go to Ezekiel 33. And actually, these texts can be found in 3 different locations in Ezekiel, so I picked 2 of them. So we'll pick up in Ezekiel 33 and verse 10. And he says, therefore, O son of man, speak unto the house of Israel, and thus ye speak, saying, if our transgressions and our sins be upon us, and we pine away in them, how shall we live? How can we as sinners live is the question that Ezekiel is presenting here. Verse 11, he says, and this is Yahweh speaking, he says, say unto them, as I live, saith the Lord Yahweh, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked, what? Turn from his way and live. In other words, the just shall live by faith. Turn ye from your evil ways, for why will you die, O house of Israel? So what is required to do for a sinner, or what is required for a sinner to do to live? So Ezekiel is answering this question. And if you notice on the screen, I've got certain texts in green, and I got certain texts in yellow. The texts in green represent the sinner, the wicked person. When he turns from his ways, there's a promise that comes along with that. He shall live. Okay. Verse 12, therefore, thou son of man, say unto the children of thy people, the righteousness of the righteous shall not deliver him in the day of his what? His transgression. Okay, so and then as for the wickedness of the wicked, he shall not fall thereby in the day that he turns from his wickedness. So I want you to see the contrast here, that a righteous person, he's living according to the Torah, the obedience of the Torah, when in the day that he turns from doing that, okay, and he turns to transgressing the Torah, Ezekiel is posing the issue here is, can his righteousness that he was doing before, living where the just shall live by faith, will his righteousness, when he turns to transgression, will it deliver him in the day that he turns? No, it will not. But for a wicked man, it says that he shall not fall in the day that he turns from his wickedness. Neither shall the righteous be able to live for his righteousness in the day that he sins. Verse 13, when I shall say to the righteous that he shall surely live, if he trust in his own righteousness. Now this is where Ezekiel gets in and he defines what it means to trust in one's own righteousness. Okay? If he trusts in his own righteousness, and what's the next three words? And commit iniquity, all his righteousness shall not be remembered. But for his iniquity that he hath committed, he shall die for it. So again, we see here that a righteous man, he's living according to Torah. He's being obedient, and he's living by faith, trusting that God will take care of his sins. But he's living in obedience because he loves the Father. It says here, though, that righteous man, if he commits iniquity and he trusts in his own righteousness and then goes into committing iniquity, will his righteousness deliver him? No, it shall not. Okay? None of the righteousness that he did before shall be remembered. And then verse 14, again, when I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, if he turns from his sin and do that which is lawful and right, if the wicked restore the pledge, give again that he had robbed, walk in the statutes of life, without committing iniquity, he shall surely live, he shall not die. None of his sins that he hath committed shall be mentioned unto him. He hath done that which is lawful and right, he shall surely live. Yet the children of thy people say, the way of the Lord is not equal. But as for them, their way is not equal. Again, when the righteous turns from his righteousness and commits iniquity, he shall even die thereby. But if the wicked turn from his wickedness and do that which is lawful and right, he shall live thereby. So we see Ezekiel kind of repeats himself multiple times here, but he makes it very clear. A righteous man, if he does righteousness and continues therein, the Bible says, and he shall surely live. The just shall live by faith. But if he turns from his wickedness and he trusts, or if he turns from his righteousness and he trusts that his righteousness that he was doing is going to take care of the iniquity that he's going to continue to do after that, it will not. But yet a wicked man, if he turns from his wickedness, he shall surely live. And Ezekiel 18, verses 20 and 24, pretty much repeats the same thing. So I'll mention this real quickly. So in verse 20, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. Verse 21, but if the wicked will turn from all his sins that he hath committed, and keep all my statutes, and do that which is lawful and right, he shall surely live, he shall not die. All his transgressions that he hath committed, they shall not be mentioned unto him. In his righteousness that he hath done, he shall live. I have any pleasure at all the wicked should die, saith the Yahweh, and not that he should return from his ways and live. But when the righteous turns away from his righteousness and commits iniquity, and doeth according to all the abominations that the wicked man doeth, shall he live? All his righteousness that he hath done shall not be mentioned. In his trespass that he hath trespassed, and in his sin that he hath sinned, in them he shall die. So I hope you get a good understanding of what it means for the just to live by faith. So in summary here, if a wicked man, a transgressor, turns from all his wicked ways and does that which is lawful and right, he shall live. The Torah definition of one trusting in his own righteousness. If one who is living righteous turned away and commits iniquity, his previous righteous acts shall no longer be mentioned. He shall surely die. And the righteousness of the righteous shall not deliver him in the day when he transgresses God's Torah, turning away from living righteous. So this is what the term "the just shall live by faith" correctly interpreted looks like. And not the hearers of the law shall be justified, but the doers of the law shall be justified. So back to Galatians. So we pick up in chapter 3, verse 6. So even as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. And the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all the nations be blessed. So then they which be of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham. So some key points in these verses. Abraham's faith was considered an act of righteousness. And those that practice the faith of Abraham, for example, walking in the steps of Abraham, are considered children of Abraham, even though they are from another nation, even though they are uncircumcised. So the Torah declares that God would justify other nations through faith. And God preached the gospel to Abraham, stating that in him, in Abraham, all nations of the earth shall be blessed. And I want to point out, too, here that Abraham's faith was considered an act of righteousness, and that he received the promise, of the promised seed. He received the promise that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through him, and that promised one that would come through him would be the Messiah. He received that promise when he was in uncircumcision. So that's an important point to consider. So let's go back to see where we're at. So the Torah declares that God would justify other nations through faith. God preached the gospel. This is another interesting thing, that God preached the gospel side to Abraham, stating that in him, Abraham, all nations shall be blessed. So the gospel was preached before Messiah came. And this can be found in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And it says, now Yahweh had said unto Abraham, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee all nations, or all families of the earth shall be blessed. So who was God referring to that was in Abraham that would be the source of blessings of all nations? It was Yeshua. Now keep in mind that this promise to Abraham will become key to answering the dilemma that Paul and the apostles had addressed in Acts 15 in terms of reconciling the reason for this dilemma that came from Exodus 12, verses 48 and 49. So just keep this in mind, that this promise to Abraham, that he would be a blessing and the source of a blessing of all nations, Yeshua would be coming through him. It's key to understanding some things to reconcile this dilemma that Paul was dealing with. Okay, picking up back in Galatians chapter 3, starting in verse 10. For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. And that curse that Paul's referring to can be summed up in this: the soul that sinneth, it shall die. This is the law of sin and death, i.e. the curse of the law. Verse 11, but that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it's evident, for the just shall live by faith. Verse 12, and the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them shall live in them. Now I put there in parentheses to help explain, because this was a very difficult passage to understand, verse 12. And it says, and the law is not of faith. So what is it referring to here? Well, that word of, not of, is the Greek ek, and it means it did not originate from. So to help us understand what this is talking about, it says that the law did not originate from faith. So we're going to dig into that a little bit deeper here in a minute. Verse 13, it says, the Messiah hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. So who was made a curse for us? He was referring to the Messiah. The Messiah, he was made a curse for us. He was the one who had to bear our sins on the tree. For it is written, cursed is everyone that hangs on a tree. And I make that point because some might interpret that this curse is the law, but it's not the law. Messiah was made a curse for us. Not that he sinned or anything, but when we sin, there's a curse that comes upon mankind for sinning, and Messiah had to bear that curse that really was our cause, what we caused. Verse 14, it says that the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Yeshua the Messiah, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So some key points in these verses here, because there was a lot to unpack here. When Paul used the terms, who are of the works of the law, he's not speaking evil of those that follow the Torah, but rather he's making a case that Israel, or the Jews, who are of the works of the law, who receive the Torah, they still have to rely on faith. So how do I know this? Paul goes on to say, immediately making the statement, that the just shall live by faith. And the man that doeth them, doeth what? Doeth the Torah, shall live in them, meaning they shall live by faith as they do them. We can also see this explained in Romans 2, verses 12 through 29. And so another point, what did Paul mean when he said, and the law is not of faith? Does it mean that obeying the law, the Torah, is not a result of faith? This thinking conflicts with many of scriptures. And consider the Apostle James, who stated, even so faith, if it have not works, is dead, being alone. And he says, and I will show thee my faith by my works. So what did he mean when he said, and the law is not of faith? Well, the first question we need to ask, what is the context of Paul's epistle here? He's dealing with a very specific thing in the Torah, in the law, the circumcision of the flesh. So when Paul stated in verse 12, and the law is not of faith, it did not originate from faith, he was speaking in the context of the law of circumcision that was given to Abraham. And so what is Paul's argument as it relates to the law of circumcision here? So when he said that the law is not of faith, how is he using this for his argument? So there's a couple of things we can look at here to understand this. Number one, the law of circumcision, it did not originate from faith. It originated from God as a result of a promise he made to Abraham. And something interesting here is that, remember, the law of circumcision was given to Abraham after he was considered, or he was given the promise. So the law of circumcision didn't come into effect until after Yahweh made the promise to Abraham. Okay, so circumcision was the sign of the covenant that Yahweh made to Abraham. That promise I propose to you was fulfilled starting with Isaac's birth and concluding with Yeshua's birth, the promised seed through Abraham and his seed. Messiah was not promised to come through any other seed than Abraham. And circumcision was the sign. It was the signature. And in today's terminology, you might think of it as the UPS tracking number to prove and to confirm the true Messiah. He had to come through Abraham's lineage, no others. Circumcision was the outward sign of Abraham's lineage. So when Paul made the statement that the law is not of faith, it's in the context of this law of circumcision. Okay. Number two, the act of physical circumcision, according to the law of Moses, cannot save you. It requires the faith that God will provide the means to be justified. Therefore, by deduction, the law of circumcision is not of faith. It does not bring the forgiveness of sins. And if we look at Romans 2, verses 25 through 28, it mentions here to help establish this interpretation. Paul says here that for circumcision it verily profits if you keep the Torah. But if you be a breaker of the Torah, the circumcision is made uncircumcision. So I bring this in because I want to separate the specific issue in the law that Paul is dealing with. He's not dealing with all the law, the commandments and statutes and judgments. He's dealing with this very specific issue, circumcision. Okay. Verse 28 and 29 says, "For he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God." So in the following verses, we're going to read where Paul provides insights into the purpose of the law of circumcision. And this is where you might consider this is going to be a paradigm shift for you. So as we read on Galatians chapter 3, picking up in verse 15. Well, I also wanted to mention, some of the explanations of the law is not of faith. You can also read in Romans chapter 4 and verse 14. I'll just go ahead and read that. It's not on the screen, but I do want to mention that to help again explain what did Paul mean when he said that the law is not of faith. In Romans chapter 4, verses 14, actually, if you back up in verse 11, it's talking about the sign of circumcision, the seal of righteousness that was given to Abraham. And dropping down to verse 14, it says, "For if they which are of the law, the circumcised of Abraham, be heirs," who are heirs, inheritors of the promises, "faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect." So this again gives us some insight into what Paul meant when he said the law is not of faith. In other words, applying it to what Paul's saying in Romans 4:14 here, he's saying that if you're a physical seed of Abraham and circumcised in the flesh, that does not make you an heir, an inheritor of the promises through Messiah. It's by faith. So that, I hope, helps explain what Paul meant, that the law is not of faith. It doesn't diminish the importance of keeping the moral law of the Torah and the other the things that are in the Torah, but specifically to circumcision is what Paul is arguing and making a case here. That law is not of faith. So picking up in Galatians 3 and starting in verse 15. "So, brethren, I speak after the manner of men, though it be but a man's covenant." And I want you to notice I put in parentheses some questions to help us understand, these difficult scriptures that Paul is bringing up here. So what covenant of man is Paul talking about here? Though it be but a man's covenant. Paul's talking about this covenant of circumcision. He says, "Yet if it be confirmed, no man disannulleth or addeth thereto." In other words, man cannot change the purpose of the covenant of circumcision. He can't disannul it, do away with it, and he can't add to. Verse 16, "Now Abraham and his seed were the promises made. And he saith not to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is the Messiah." So what is Paul saying here? The promise was given to Abraham and his children, right? And this covenant of circumcision was given to them. The Messiah had to come through his seed line, no other. And the promise to Abraham resulted in the Messiah, the promised Messiah, coming through his seed line. Verse 17, "And this I say, that the covenant," what covenant? It's circumcision, "that was confirmed before of God in Messiah, in the law, the Torah, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promise of none effect. For if inheritance be of the law, it is no more of promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise. So again, there's a lot to unpack in these verses here. But I want to take each verse and explain and connect the dots so you understand that Paul isn't talking about the whole Torah. He's not talking about the whole law. He's talking about the law of circumcision contained in the Torah. And so, in verse 17, this covenant, and I say the covenant of circumcision, it was confirmed before of God in the Messiah, the Torah, which was 430 years after. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this timing. 430 years after, this covenant of circumcision was it was confirmed 430 years after it was given to Abraham. Okay, 430 years after. And then verse 18, for if the inheritance be of the law, again, what law is this talking about? It's the law, it's this covenant of circumcision. And we just read in Romans 4:14 there that, for if they which are of the law be heirs, if they're the ones who inherited the promises, faith is made void and the promise of none effect. So this is what Paul's talking about here. The inheritance of the law of circumcision. If it be of the law, in other words, if it's physical circumcision that saves you, then is no more of promise. But God gave it to Abraham by promise. So I just want to make it very clear, the law and the covenant that Paul is dealing with here is the covenant of circumcision, the law of circumcision. In Genesis chapter 17, and this is where he was given, Yahweh gave the promise and this covenant to Abraham. Starting in verse 9. And God said unto Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant therefore, thou, thy seed after thee in their generations. And this is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you, and thy seed after you. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. And it shall be a token of the covenant between me and you. Now understand and take note here, this covenant of circumcision is a token of the covenant between me and you, okay? Because the covenant involved more than just circumcision. It involved a promise. And the circumcision was just the seal. It was the sign. It was the token of this promised seed that would come through Abraham's physical lineage. In verse 12, and he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generations. He that is born in the house or bought with money or of any stranger which is not of thy seed, he that is born in thy house and he that is bought with thy money must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. Now, why was this so important to God in his eyes, that this covenant be carried out from generation to generation? Because it was a promise of the coming Messiah, coming through Abraham's seed. And if anyone in his lineage, would have tried to stop that promise coming. For example, if you remember Tamar, she was one that she had a husband who died, and then his brother took her to be his wife, and he spilled his seed on the ground, okay? And so that left Tamar barren and without child. And I believe she knew that the promise of the coming Messiah through Abraham's seed had to be fulfilled if the nation and all the nations had any hope of receiving this promise through Abraham. And so she dressed up, as somebody different than who she was, as a harlot. And when Judah came through town, you know the story, how he laid with her, not knowing that she was Tamar, his daughter-in-law. And but because of what she did, she was able to make sure, continue the lineage of Abraham, that the promised seed would come through her. So that's why that Yahweh was so, this was something that was very special to Yahweh, that Abraham's children would do, that they would circumcise their children so that through his lineage, the promised seed would come. So what law was confirmed 430 years later? When the promise was given to Abraham, that's when the counting started. When the blessing was given to Abraham, that promise, it started counting then. It was the law of circumcision. It was confirmed 430 years later. And when and where was it confirmed? When Yahweh brought Israel out of Egypt at Mount Sinai. And we can read this in Exodus chapter 12. And again, this is where the dilemma began. This is where the dilemma that Paul had to deal with when the Gentiles began coming into the assembly. It all stemmed from understanding this promise that was given to Abraham, confirmed in the Torah 430 years later. Let's read. So in verse 40 of Exodus 12, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt, it was 430 years. Now remember, Paul just talked about this time frame in Galatians, and it was concerning the law of circumcision, right? So, and it came to pass at the end of 430 years, now I know it's stated here in verse 40 that the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. Now we know from the history that Israel was not in Egypt for 430 years. It was closer to 200 to 210. So how do we reconcile the interpretation here, the translation here? This 430 years was from the promise to Abraham. And so from the time the promise was given to Abraham, the journeying of Israel, of Abraham's descendants, was 430 years before they came out of Egypt to head to the promised land. So it didn't start when Israel got to Egypt. It started when the promise was given to Abraham. And remember, Abraham was warned, given in a dream, that his descendants, would be in bondage and slavery for many years. Okay, so that's where the timing begins here, when the promise was given to Abraham. So it came to pass, verse 41, at the end of 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass that all the host of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be much observed unto Yahweh for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. For this is a night of Yahweh to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations. And Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. There shall no stranger eat thereof. But every man's servant that is bought for money, when thou hast circumcised him, then shall he eat thereof. A foreigner, a hired servant, shall not eat thereof. In one house shall it be eaten. Thou shalt not carry it forth out of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall ye break a bone thereof. And all the congregation of Israel shall keep it. In verse 48, and when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, and will keep the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as one that is born in the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. One law shall be to him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourns among you. So thus did all the children of Israel, as Yahweh commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. And it came to pass the selfsame day that Yahweh did bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their armies. So we see this connection between the promise of Abraham and the covenant of circumcision, and then that being confirmed 430 years later when Israel came out of Egypt. And the observance of the Passover, the institution of the Passover after they came out of Egypt, Yahweh told them that all strangers who want to sojourn with Israel and keep the Passover, they must be circumcised. So this is what Paul is dealing with. This is what he's talking about here in Galatians chapter 3. And so with that in mind, let's pick up in verse 19 of Galatians 3. So wherefore then serveth the law? What law is Paul referring to here? What has been the whole context of Paul's letter? It was the law of circumcision. It says it was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made. So it was added because of the law of circumcision was added because of transgressions until the seed should come to whom the promise was made. And it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Now, a mediator is not a mediator of one, but God is one. So let's unpack this a little bit. So for many years, I was taught, and it was understanding these verses here meant that this law was talking about the sacrificial system. And some have even taken it as talking about, all the laws in the Torah, the Ten Commandments and everything else. But is that true? Is that what Paul was talking about here? No. The whole issue in Galatians was talking about the law of circumcision. So why would Paul change gears here and now just throw the whole law in here, or the law of sacrifices, something he hasn't been talking about or even dealing with or even hinting to up until this point? The verses here concerning wherefore then serveth the law of circumcision, because remember that Paul was debating the importance of circumcision that some felt that the Gentiles had to do in order to be saved, and Paul's saying no. Okay, so this is what Paul's addressing. So what was the purpose of the law of circumcision? Romans chapter 3 and 4 deal with the same question. What advantage hath a Jew? What advantage hath circumcision? Much in every way. Okay, so that's what Paul's referring to here. It isn't the law of sacrifices. It isn't the law of the Ten Commandments. It's talking about the law of circumcision. It was added because of transgressions. Mankind needed a Savior. They needed a means of reconciling their sins so they could come back into communion with God. So this promise given to Abraham was given to him that all nations of the earth shall be blessed. So let's continue on in verse 21. So is the law, what law have we been talking about? The law of circumcision. Is it then against the promises of God? God forbid. Now, why is Paul making the statement, is it against the promises of God? In other words, if we were commanded to do it, if Abraham's seed was commanded to do it, and now it's not necessary for the Gentiles, is he saying, is it against the promises now? No. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, verily righteousness should have been by the law. But Scripture hath concluded all under sin, and that the promise by faith of Yeshua the Messiah might be given to them that believe. So what promise is he talking about? What promise of faith was Paul referencing here? It was a promise to Abraham and confirmed with the covenant of circumcision. So Paul's making his case that the law of circumcision, yes, it had importance, it had a purpose, it had a time frame, okay? And it wasn't against the promises of God. No, it established it. It confirmed it. Verse 23, but before faith came. So what's Paul talking about here? What did faith just automatically come 2,000 years ago? Has it always been around here? So what's he talking about? Before faith came. This is referring to Yeshua, the promised one who would come through Abraham. So before faith came, before Messiah came, we were kept under the law. Again, what law are we talking about? It's the law of circumcision. We were shut up unto the faith which should afterwards be revealed. Wherefore the law, again, what law are we talking about? The law of circumcision was our schoolmaster to bring us to the Messiah, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith has come, again, now what are we talking about here? The Messiah, the promise of the Messiah. We are no longer under a schoolmaster. We're no longer under this law of circumcision. For ye are all the children of God by faith, not physical circumcision. Again, that it's if we are heirs to the promises through physical circumcision, then it's not by faith. Okay? So, but ye are children of God by faith, not circumcision, in the Messiah Yeshua. For as many of you have been baptized into Messiah, have put on Messiah. For there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male or female, for you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. And if ye be Messiahs, then ye are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So I know this was a lot to digest. As I mentioned at the beginning, there would be some paradigm shifts, some things that you have never quite heard put together this way. But I just challenge you to look at the evidence and connect the dots. It's so important that we understand the context of what the writer is trying to say. We understand his audience. We understand, the cultural norms and the theological norms that existed. And so, I mentioned here that this sign, this seal of circumcision, that it was a token of the covenant. And we read earlier here, just let me back up this one screen. We read here that the law, which Paul's been talking about, the law of circumcision, was our schoolmaster to bring us to the Messiah. It was I mentioned earlier that it was a sign, the seal. It was like the UPS tracking number. It was the evidence that when Messiah came, we knew that it was the promised Messiah because he came through Abraham's seed. Okay, and once he came, once the Messiah, the promised seed came that was given to Abraham, once he had come, verse 25, we are no longer under that schoolmaster, that law of circumcision, because again, that was a token, a seal of the promise that through him all nations of the earth shall be blessed. When did that become fulfilled? It started with Isaac, because the promise had to come through Isaac. It couldn't come through Hagar. It had to come through Isaac, through Sarah. And then it was fulfilled when Messiah was born 2,000 years ago, fulfilling that promise that Yahweh had made to Abraham, and thus ending the purpose of the seal of circumcision, the sign of circumcision. Okay, so I hope this makes sense, and I hope this helps reconcile, Exodus chapter 12, verses 48 and 49, because in the Torah it does say that a stranger, if he keeps the Passover, must be circumcised. But remember, this sign was given to Abraham, confirmed in the Torah 430 years later, and it was until the Messiah came. Because once the promise came that was given to Abraham, the purpose of circumcision had completed its function. So I hope this makes sense, and I hope you consider it, and I thank you for your time. And so I just pray that this was a blessing. And if you have any comments or questions, you can contact me. Just go to our website, and my contact information is on there at mnlt.org. So again, may Yahweh bless you and keep you. Until next Shabbat, have a blessed week.